Mr. Paul Haddock. For 28 years, in 1993, Mr. Haddock moved to Kasre, one of the 4 states of the Federated States of Micronesia, where he worked as a teacher, high school principal, and state director of education for almost 18 years. In 2011, Mr. Haddock moved to Chuk, where he saw Chuk High School, managed the Chuk State Accreditation Team, and worked with the Chuk State Education Reform Team. And in March of 2017, he returned to Oahu, where he currently serves as the president and chief executive officer of Pacific Resources for Education and Learning. So now I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Paul Haddock. Thank you again. And I'll go ahead and get these slides started here for you folks.
Angela, thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. I'm like all the rest of you looking forward to the day that we can be back face to face, but I just wanted to kind of touch on the introduction a little bit. I first became a teacher in 1988 on the Big Island, right outside of Hilo and Ke'au, a small school called Henry-a-Puka-Haia School, if you know your Hawaiian history. It was there in 1988 where in the month of October, about 30 students from Micronesia showed up at our high school, doubling its size. We had 35 students in high school. We went to 70. And I was put in charge of all these students from Micronesia, and it changed my life because it became apparent by day 2, I had no idea how to teach these kids. They were wonderful, they smiled, they were super polite, and they showed up 10 minutes late to class every day. They would borrow my pencils and never give them back again. Every time I asked them a question in class, they always answered yes with a big smile, and then they would miss every question on the quiz. And I'd give them a paper back with an F on it, and they'd smile at that. And it drove me so crazy that I thought, I need to find out more about these islands. And I moved down there in 1993 and ended up living there for the next 25 years of my life. So what you're going to hear today is not something that I read about in someone else's paper or something I've studied online. These are strategies I learned living down in these islands before moving back here. So you see the title of the presentation, I wanted to kind of focus on the parentheses below, helping Elawassels, I called them. You're probably familiar with ELL students, English language learners. But if you're working with Micronesian students, they're actually English language and Western school system learners, which is why I've added the WSSL part, because it's not just a language barrier that we're facing with these students and their families. It's also how to live in Hawaii, how to go to school, how to function with the American rules and regulations that we have in our school system. And these are some of the things we want to talk about today, offer some strategies, talk about Micronesia, why they're all coming here in the first place, and what are some things we can do to help. Next slide, please. So a little bit about myself. Again, I moved down there. I married my wife, Sepe. She's half Kosraean, half Pohnpeian. We have 7 children of our own. By the way, ladies, it only costs $12 to have a baby in the hospital down there in Micronesia. And our 5th child was actually free. So I think if you have 4, you get your 5th one free. There's a little like a Subway coupon card or something we must have used. And then we also, the girl in the front with the bacon in the summer t-shirt, she's Palauan. She's our island adopted daughter. Island adoptions down there mean that she came over to visit us one Friday night and 8 years later is still staying with us. So island adoptions are a little bit easier than American adoptions. She's now attending the University of Hilo, working on her nurse's degree. And interestingly enough, 5 of our other children are all up in Fairbanks, Alaska. So they've gone from the equator to the North Pole and experienced quite a bit of everything. But I wanted you to see what our family looked like. We had a big family to American standards, but my wife came from a family with 10 brothers and sisters. Her mother came from a family with 16 brothers and sisters. So actually a normal family size is a little bit bigger than what we have. So that's a little bit about me. I just, again, wanted you to know that twice in my life, first in 1993, when I first moved down there, I didn't speak the language. I didn't like to eat rice or fish, and I moved to a place where that's all we ate. I didn't know how to live in very crowded houses. I was used to my privacy. And then again in 2017, after 25 years of learning how to live on an island, moving back to a big city, where suddenly I didn't know how to get on the bus. I didn't know how to open up a bank account. I didn't know how to use the automatic checkout machines at the stores. Twice in my life, I've had to make a huge, dramatic cultural shift. So I know what many of these families are experiencing as they come here to Hawaii. But I still have enough of my American side brain to also understand the frustrations that many of the teachers and schools are experiencing as they try to help these families as they move in. So that's kind of what we want to talk about today. Next slide, please. But first, a little bit about Micronesia. Now, there's no such place as Micronesia. We're going to use the term Micronesia today, but really this is an outward term that was put together for some of these islands. When you hear about Micronesia, Polynesia, Melanesia, I'm sure you've already heard, that's not how the islanders very often refer to themselves. But for simplicity's sake, please forgive me that I'm going to use that today. There are three major island nations that we're going to talk about. The first is the Marshall Islands, which is about 1,500 miles to the west of Hawaii. You may be most familiar with the Marshall Islands because in the late 40s, early 50s, the US conducted about 67 nuclear tests out in the Marshall Islands, including a couple tests that were near enough to inhabited islands that the fallout fell on the people there. Because the American government kind of wanted to know what would happen if we got into a war with the Soviet Union. What would fallout do if it landed on a major American city? But we couldn't really test that on New York. And the feeling was, well, these Pacific Islanders aren't exactly equal to us, so let's test it on them. We had an employee of ours who was the daughter, the first female president of the Marshall Islands. She did a poem called Anointed, which you can find on YouTube. It's for free. It's a beautiful movie. It's about 5 minutes long. Feel free to use it in class or with your community groups, where she stands on one of these huge concrete domes in the Marshalls that is filled with nuclear radiation metallic devices from one of the bombs that didn't fully explode. So on an island called Runit. But on many of these islands, the people have not been allowed to return home. So they were promised one Sunday at church back 70 years ago by the US military that we want to test on your islands. This is going to help the entire world, and soon you'll be able to return home. But the nuclear fallout's been so damaging that 70 years later, they still can't return home, probably never will be able to return home. So the Marshall Islands, that's them. We still have one of our largest American bases there on Kwajalein. So many of the military people passing through Hawaii have spent some time on Kwajalein. That's where one of our major defensive missile bases are. So if you were in Hawaii 3 or 4 years ago when we got that tweet early on a Saturday morning that there was an incoming missile, if that had been real, it would have been the island of Kwajalein that probably would have sent up defensive missiles to try to protect us. So that's the Marshall Islands. They all speak one language, and they're one of the large population groups coming here. Many of them are moving to Arkansas. Arkansas has one of the largest Marshallese populations in the world outside of the Marshall Islands. And they're actually doing quite well there. The state government has translated a lot of documents, everything from driver's licenses, a driver's test into Marshallese. The school systems are very proactive with how to help the Marshallese students. So the largest group has moved to Arkansas. Then the next nation to the west is called the Federated States of Micronesia. We just call it the FSM. The FSM is quite different from the Marshall Islands in that the 4 states, Kosrae, where my wife is from, I lived there for 18 years, then Pohnpei, where the capital is, Chuuk is the one most of you are probably familiar with, and then Yap. These 4 states are completely different states. They speak different languages. There's probably over a dozen major languages in the 4 states. The religion changes as they go from east to west, from Protestant to Roman Catholic. The culture is a little bit different. The Federated States of Micronesia became a nation because the US kind of put it together. So it's got a very weak government. Most of the powers reside in the states. So when your students come from the Federated States of Micronesia, they will never refer to themselves as, I'm a Federated States of Micronesian. They will usually say, I'm Chuukese. They will say, I'm Pohnpeian or Kosraean. There's not too many Yappies coming here. There's a large Yappies community on Kauai, but on Oahu, mostly Pohnpeians, Kosraeans, and then a largest number are Chuukese that are moving here. And that's how they will refer to themselves from the state that they are from. You will also notice there's a number of outer islands. I always encourage schools and community groups, if you've got a student who says, or a family who says they're Chuukese, find out what island they're from. Because in Pohnpei, Yap, and Chuuk, there'll be one major central island with the airport, electricity, and generally fairly good English spoken. But there are dozens of these outlying islands far away where very rarely will you speak English. There may not even be electricity on the island or cars. So they're coming from a small island with 300 or 400 people. They're landing in Oahu. They're suddenly going to a school with 1,000 kids in it. It's a huge difference. So try to find out not just what state they're from, but what island they are from. And then the furthest west, the third major nation is Palau. Not too many Palauans are coming here. They're coming here for college, but not too many are coming for elementary or high school. So those are the three nations that we call Micronesia. You'll also see Guam and then Saipan, or the CNMI, are there. They are actually part of the US. So the president of the United States is the president of Guam and the president of the Northern Mariana Islands. But the Marshalls, the FSM, and Palau have their own presidents. Okay, next slide, please. Now, by the way, if while we're going through this, you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat box and we'll be addressing them at the end. You probably have heard the term COFA, or the Compact of Free Association, and a lot of people don't know what that is or why it's impacting Hawaii so much. If you're old like me, you remember the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union, as soon as World War II ended, suddenly became enemies. And there was a big discussion on what should happen in the Pacific with these islands that the United States had liberated from Japan. Should we just let them suddenly become free, or should we, keep an eye on them so they don't go under the Soviet Union? So from the time that the war ended in 1945 until about 1986, the US kept these islands as a trust territory. So we had military people running the islands. But those nations wanted their independence. They finally became independent, but the US didn't want them to be completely independent because they wanted them to stay as allies. So they came up with this treaty that's unique to these three nations. It's found nowhere else in the world, called the Compact of Free Association, with the Marshalls, the FSM, and Palau. The main thing the US gets from this compact is this idea of strategic denial. No other nation can go through the waters up there or the economic zones. No other nation like North Korea or China or Russia can build military bases up there. The US pretty much controls 2.5 to 3 million square miles of the North Pacific. So if anything were to ever happen to those three nations, the US would come in and defend them. So young people from those three nations join the US military. Those three nations don't have their own military forces. So that's the main thing the US gets from this. What those three nations get are yearly payments from the US for things like education, health, building new infrastructure. So all the years I was a teacher out there, your tax dollar paid for my salary. And I always feel I should say thank you for that. It wasn't a whole lot, by the way, but I do appreciate that you kept me in Pringles and fresh fish for about 25 years. The other thing, though, that those nations get, which really impacts Hawaii, is when the compact first started in 1986, the US wanted these nations to develop their own independent economies and governments. So what they said is, send us your college-age students. And to make it easy for them to come, we're going to give people from these three nations free entry into the United States. All you will need is your passport. And a lot of students came and they went to the University of Oregon, Oregon State. They started coming to UH Manoa. Many of them went to UH Hilo more than UH Manoa. And we made it as easy as possible for them to enter. In fact, it's easier for a person from Micronesia to come into the US than it is for somebody from Canada to come into the US. But this was the point at the beginning in the mid 80s. Come, get your college degree, and then return home to the islands, become the future leadership. The problem was, though, that as the compact continued, and it's been almost 40 years now, these nations did not develop economically. A lot of the promises from the US side were never fulfilled. So even today, minimum wage on many of these islands is a little over $1 an hour. The health systems are very, very weak. So as the diet has changed, because a lot of Western food has come in, a lot of greasy, heavier foods and sugary drinks have come in, diabetes is now one of the #1 killers of people on the islands. And yet 40 years into this relationship with the US, there's not one dialysis machine in any of these 3 nations. So as people are getting diabetes, they're coming to Hawaii to get their dialysis done. There's not one locally trained surgeon in any of these 3 nations 40 years in. So one of the main reasons people are coming here now is not for college anymore, but it's for health. It's for the economic benefits. It's for a better education system. So what started out as a send us your college students suddenly became everybody is coming this way. And the only airline that flies down through the islands is United Airlines. So a bit of an irony here is that where they land at all the local airports, they hire local people to work, and they give as one of their benefits free tickets to those workers who then share them with their family members. So many of the people who are coming here to one of the most expensive cities in the US are flying for free and arriving here with no money in their pockets. And so suddenly they need to find a place to live. They're coming in without a credit score, which means they can't get a house to live. And they're all living together in some of the Section 8 housing in places like Mayor Wright housing, KPT, some of these areas. And that's why schools and community services in those areas are finding themselves swamped with these large numbers of people coming in. Now, the compact will never end. It's a treaty with no ending to it. However, October 1st, 2022, parts of the compact will end. And the part of the compact that's slated to end, unless it's renewed, is the money part. So the US will get to keep strategic denial forever, but the 150 million or so that they send down there every year will stop in about 1.5 years, which means that every teacher, every health worker whose paycheck is coming through the compact will be losing their job. So guess what they're all going to be doing over the next 1.5 years? They're going to be jumping on airplanes and either going to Guam or coming here to Oahu or to the state of Hawaii. So you might say, well, at our school, we don't have too many of these students right now. That number is going to explode, I think, over the next 1.5 years. Now, there are renegotiations right now to try to continue the compact, and it's in everybody's best interest to do so. But I think we're going to see a growing number of people coming from the islands here. I like to call this tidal wave of Micronesians the microwave. It's coming our way. So even if you have a small number of Micronesian students or parents, expect that number to grow. So it's a good opportunity, because I think we're behind already, to try to learn some strategies to help the community as they assimilate into Hawaii. Because most of them are very, very nice people. They do want to do well. They're facing a lot of discrimination when they're coming in and a lot of obstacles. I face some of it myself. How can the state of Hawaii and how can the school system address some of these needs? Okay, next slide, please. What we're going to talk about now are some of the traditional education systems so that you can see some of the gaps they're facing in the classroom when they come here. So traditionally on a small island or in many of these islands, you learned a very specific skill that would benefit the community versus an American system, which we talk about like the Common Core. We try to prepare students for a little bit of everything. And I'm not going to debate education systems today, but on a small island, you're part of a group. Everybody learns a specific skill to help that group. In America, we're very much more part of it's about my life. So if, you know, when I was a student, it was all, our teachers would ask us, what is your dream for the future? What are your goals? What do you want to be when you grow up? That's not an island sort of mentality. It's always more about the we. So as your island students come in, they're coming from a we background of how do we work together? What does the community see me doing? And many of the kids, that's how they think and that's how they're comfortable. So example, my wife's younger sister was pulled out of second grade to start taking care of her older sister's children. Now in America, we would be very put back by that. But if you were to talk to my wife's younger sister, she was never offended at what happened. She felt this was what I was being trained for, to help raise other young children in the family. And she received training from home to do that. So she never saw it as, oh, my future's being ripped away from me. I'm losing all these extra opportunities, because she didn't see herself as an I-centric sort of person. Many of your islanders coming in, they're used to this more we-centric thing. So education was done very, very differently. They've also probably attended very small schools where the teacher and the principal might be their father, might be their mother, might be an older sister. In the islands, we really don't have words for cousins and uncles and aunties. Everybody's called mom and dad. So they were probably attending a school with people they saw 24 hours a day. So the teachers were seen as mom and dad too, which meant discipline was done differently. If a student was missing class for a funeral or an activity, the teacher knew about it because that teacher was also mom or dad, or knew what was going on in the community. So they're going to teach, they may, especially the youngest kids, when they come in, they're going to be very quiet and very respectful, not because they're shy, but because they're coming from a cultural background where you listened to your elders, you didn't talk back. So you may also find that you ask questions of your students and they may not make eye contact with you, because looking down is a way of showing respect to their elders. You may find too that if you ask your students, do you understand? Or if you're working with parents too, and you say, do you understand what I'm saying? 99% of the time, they're going to say yes, because that's how you show respect to a family member or an elder, is not by questioning them, but answering the question in the way that would make them most happy. So when you ask the question, do you understand? 99% of the time, you're hoping the answer is going to be yes. And they're going to answer yes, even at parent meetings. Our Micronesian parents may sit in the back. They're going to shake their heads up and down. They're going to smile. They may not understand at all what's being said, but out of respect for you, that's what they're going to say. They're going to say yes, and they're going to smile, because you're seen as a titled position. A principal is a title. A teacher is a title, much like it was 150 years ago when we had chiefs and elders in the village. A lot of that's been replaced by the title teacher or principal or pastor. So to actually raise your hand and say, I don't understand, is almost a disrespectful way of saying, you, titled teacher, did not do a good job explaining to me. So it's simpler for them to just shake their head and say yes. So that's how they would treat their family members and elders. I found it better to never ask yes or no questions of my new students, especially. Now, a lot of the stuff we're going to go over today, 6 months or a year in, they're going to get much more comfortable with the Western way of doing things. But upon arrival, even the parents and the students aren't going to be comfortable with a lot of the direct confrontation conversations we have in America and in the classroom. Again, in our classrooms, we want discussions. We want activity. That's the exact opposite of how things are done. In many island classrooms, knowledge was transmitted orally. We didn't have books. So a lot of these students are coming from classrooms where they've never had a textbook before, or maybe there was just one. And then we come here where we're real big on the 50-pound textbook. The kids may not know how to use a glossary or a table of contents. So my youngest daughter is now in 4th grade here at Iroquois Point Elementary School down in Eva Beach. This year was her first year to start in-person school. So the first couple of years here, we worked on her English, we did homeschooling. And yes, I know I picked the exact worst year to put her into school. But one of the first things her teachers told me was, she doesn't seem to know how to use our books. She doesn't know what the black terms mean or how to use a glossary. And I had to tell them she's never had a book before, a textbook before. Same with the parents. So when schoolwork goes home, the parents don't assume the parents know how to do this stuff. They don't. Okay, so don't assume that the parents know how to use the written materials that we send in meetings or the way we rely on written materials for announcements. It's just not how we do stuff in the islands. Everything is oral, which, if you remember, if you were a kid in the American school system growing up, or if you're a teacher or an educator, you've probably had Maslow thrown down your throat constantly, where the bottom of the pyramid is oral and memorization. In fact, as kids, we played that telephone game where the teacher tells the first student something, you whisper it to the next student, and it goes in a circle, and by the time it comes back, it's completely different. And the message we all take away from that is oral communication is the worst way to do something. It's so easy to change the message. But I want you to understand that down in the Pacific, oral communication is the #1 way knowledge has been transmitted for 1,000 years. It's not just whispered one time. Songs and chants are written and repeated over and over again to teach very important knowledge that must be remembered. So you'll find down there that, back in the 70s, when Hawaii wanted to recover its navigation knowledge, which had been lost, they went to an outer island of Yap and found Papa Mau, who came and taught them. And Papa Mau didn't bring a bunch of books with him. He had memorized thousands of stars. He had memorized how to use the currents and the wind, and he taught this to the Hawaiian leadership like Nainoa Thompson. This is how knowledge was passed along. And knowing that lives were at stake in the middle of the ocean, you didn't just sing it one time. These kids memorize these things. And so our students, when they come here, they'll do great on the spelling bee. They'll do great on a lot of things like that. They may have difficulty on write a paper on why we should do a certain thing. The critical thinking skills might be weak, but if you're coming again from a small island where pretty much knowledge has achieved everything it needs to, for the longest time, we didn't have to change how we learned. It's only been the last 40 years where new diseases have come in, where the internet has suddenly made all sorts of information available, that we've started to try to emphasize critical analysis thinking skills. So as your students and as your parents come in, they're not going to be always very good at asking deep questions or thinking critically. It's not because they're not smart. These kids can learn 3 and 4 languages. My children speak 3 or 4 very different languages, and they'll learn them quickly, but it's a completely different way of learning for the students and the parents as they come here. Again, we do a lot more question and response learning that way. That's not how it was done in the islands. All sorts of assessments were always done hands-on. You went out and performed a task to show that you had mastered a task. The whole concept of sitting still for 4 hours to take a bubble test, which even in America we know is nonsense, but again, that's for another day, was just not the sort of thing we would do in the islands. In the islands, it's, can you build a local house? Can you do the local medicine? Can you make the local foods? Can you fix a net? Can you catch fish? Can you raise children? These were all done outside. Learning was not done in a hot concrete building. It was done outside on the beaches, in the ocean, in the forest, on the farm. And that's how young people learned. So again, for their parents sometimes, for communities coming in, it's difficult to understand the whole concept of sitting still for hours at a time to hear someone telling me something that we're not actually doing. Which leads us to this very last thing about the cultural activities. You may find that your parents and your students tend to just miss stuff a lot. We hear there's a funeral and suddenly a kid is gone for a week. Or we're trying to do a parent-teacher meeting and nobody shows up. Or we're trying to do a data collection instrument, nobody's turning in the information. And they tell me instead there's a church activity, or there's a funeral, or somebody's leaving. In the islands, these cultural activities are part of the education. They don't separate this from sitting in class. So it's very common on some of the smaller islands that if somebody on the island dies, for the next 1 week or 2 weeks, school is completely shut down. And for the next 2 weeks, people fish to make sure there's enough food for everybody who's coming in. People will be up all night cooking food. The whole family comes together and talks and tells stories. This is not, they're not punishing their education, putting it aside to do this. This is an actual part of how you live on an island. So it is seen as an education. So it's never considered absenteeism or skipping school when they stay home on the islands when this sort of thing is happening. Of course, in Hawaii, it's much different. You can't just vanish for 2 weeks or stop attending meetings or not go to work. I had a friend who just got a big promotion at his job who the day after the promotion, there was a funeral and for the next 2 weeks didn't go to work. Then he went in and was shocked that he had been fired. And I tried to tell him, well, in America, you can't just not go to work for 2 weeks like that. You need to notify someone, and just notifying them might not be enough. To him, it was, this funeral is the number one. Our family always comes first. I need to be at this. I can't not be at it. And my daughters need to help cook for it. They can't go to school the next day. So we're finding these cultural obstacles of when they come here to where we make work, we make school on the same or even more important level than some of these family activities. So again, I know a lot of these things can be frustrating. I'm not trying to condone missing school for 2 weeks at a time, but understand that as these communities come in, this is the gap that they need to figure out how to cross too. They're not just trying to be annoying. They're not just saying school's not important. That's one of the number one questions I get from educators in Hawaii. Is education even a priority for these families? Yes, but it's the same priority as a number of these other things. All right, next slide, please. So what are some of the issues they're facing as families as they come here? Number one is just paperwork. We find that they're not coming in with transcripts, with shot records, with a credit score. And the thing is, it's not an easy fix. If you're from Chuuk and you're from an outer island where once or twice a year a boat goes there, if they show up, we're finding a 6 to 8 month time gap between the times the families are coming here and their children can go to school, or the parents can get a Social Security card. There's this huge gap because they just don't have proper paperwork. They'll have a passport, but very often the name on the passport isn't spelled the same as the name on a birth certificate. And that spelling is not the same as the name on the transcript. So down there, we don't really worry about spelling because everybody knows everybody else. So a lot of names are spelled 3 or 4 different ways. So one of the biggest frustrations has been just as they show up, the very first entry barrier. How can we get them into a housing thing if they don't have a credit score? How can we get them into school if they have no records? Everybody gets vaccinated down there, by the way, from the time they're born. We all get our shots. But if you don't bring your shot record, that doesn't help you. So what we're trying to do, we're working with the Hawaii Department of Education and Hawaii State to get paperwork down into the islands before they come, so they have access to, here's what you're going to need in the state of Hawaii before you arrive here. The other problem we're finding is when you live on a small island, either in the Marshalls or the FSM, everybody knows who you are. So if I'm out, if one of my children is out, one of my sons is out, and he gets into a fight, 14 cousins and uncles are there, and they deal with it immediately. If he's in the wrong, he's going to be sat down by his relatives. He's going to be disciplined. He's going to be talked to. And then we come here, and suddenly all of that safety net is gone. So we're finding 2 problems are resulting. One is parents have never had to raise their children on their own. So just as mom and dad raising my kids without 14 other people watching them all day long, I've never had to worry about where they were after school, because wherever they were, a relative knew where they were. Versus now I'm in Oahu, or I'm on Hawaii someplace, where when they're not with me, nobody's closely watching them who can report to me what is happening. So parents are having to be trained on, these are your responsibilities now that you're in America, which they've never had to do before. Also, we're finding that kids, who, especially as they get older, are going to act in a certain way, suddenly no longer have a safety net who can raise some warning flags or who can discipline improper behavior right away. And their parents aren't doing it at home because they've never had to. So kids are starting to go off the deep end at schools or in the community. And we're seeing some concerning crime numbers in the state. Now, interestingly enough, there's been a study done that the further east the Micronesian families move, the better they do. So there's large Micronesian populations in Wisconsin and Minnesota. There's a village in Minnesota where half of the people are Chukis, and they're all doing well. They've all got jobs. They're doing well in school. The Marshallese populations in Arkansas. There's Kosraean populations in Texas and Virginia. For some reason, when they get to those areas, they seem to be doing so much better than they're doing in Guam and Hawaii. And we're not quite sure why that is. Is it just these other places have winter where you've got to be a little bit more serious about, I can't just be messing around and get homeless versus Hawaii. So it's something we're trying to look into and have been looking into for a number of years. Why are there so many extra issues here on Oahu, the Big Island? Now, interestingly, there's populations in Lanai, a very large Kosraean population in Lanai. The population group in Kauai don't seem to be having some of the discipline issues we're finding here in Oahu. So there's still some mystery on why that is happening, but part of it is just the safety net is no longer there. Everything is brand new. I try to tell people that when I first brought my wife here, she'd never been to Hawaii before. She'd never seen an escalator. She had never seen an elevator before. And her first day here, we were living downtown, and I wanted to take her out to a Chinese restaurant. And I showed it to her. It was across the street on Bishop Street. And so she just started walking across a 4-lane roadway because where she was from, the roads are very small, very occasional cars. A car will stop for you when you start crossing the street. This is not how we do things in Hawaii. She wasn't at the crosswalk. She wasn't at the corner. She just starts walking across the street. And I had to grab her by the arm and say, that you can't do that here. It never, it never even occurred to me. She didn't know how to cross the street yet. These are the sort of things. I like to tell a story about my daughter. When I took her to college on the East Coast, we went in January. We arrived in Washington, D.C. at 6 in the morning around January 4th, just as a big storm had hit. I was taking her to Philadelphia to visit my family. It was like that she had never met. It was like 6 in the morning. We were getting on a small commuter flight from D.C. to Philadelphia. And as we were walking through the jetway, we were getting on first. There were only like 16 people on the plane. We were getting on the flight, and as we walked through the jetway, for the first time in her life, as my daughter breathed out, she saw smoke come out of her mouth, the steam from the cold weather. She had never seen that before, and it just stopped her there in the jetway. And she started pushing her hand through the smoke. She kept breathing out 2 or 3 times. To her, it was the most amazing thing she had ever seen. Meanwhile, behind her, 16 businessmen were stuck freezing to death in the jetway. And finally, one of them said, "Would you please make her move?" They were all frustrated and angry at her. She had no idea that there were people stuck behind her. She saw this new thing of smoke coming out of her mouth, and it overwhelmed her. So a lot of times these families and these kids are going to come in, and they're going to drive you nuts doing things that they don't know are rude. They just have never seen this before. They've never seen a classroom with an aquarium at the back. They just see fish. I tell people too, the first time I took my wife to Guam, there was a fancy hotel there with these beautiful fish in it. And she walked over and stuck her hand in one of them because in Micronesia, when you see fish like that, you grab one for dinner. These were expensive Japanese fish. I had to run over in slow motion and grab her. Again, she wasn't trying to break the law. She just was acting like she would act. So a lot of these kids are going to do things. They may see a fire alarm that says pull. They didn't know they're not supposed to pull it, but they've never seen, probably many of them have never been in a building with air conditioning. They've never seen remote controls before. The amount of paperwork we do here to accomplish anything is not something they've ever experienced before. So a lot of these things, we just have to be very patient. They'll figure it out. They're going to learn it, but don't automatically assume that they're lazy or they're rude, or they don't want to learn. They're just too quiet to ask. Again, the very first time I got on a bus in Oahu, I saw a front door and a back door. I walked in the back door and everybody started yelling at me. I didn't know you weren't supposed to go in the second door. I didn't know you had to go in the front door. It would be another month before I tried to get on a bus again. So these sort of small things, just expect those sorts of things to happen. And as we're talking about parents, the definition for parent in the islands is everybody who is older than the child. So this, down on the islands, I had 3 older daughters. Then I had a kind of a whoops baby, we called it, who came along a few years later. Sonia, my youngest daughter, was raised by all of her older brothers and sisters. They were her mother and father. They could, in the islands, sign a paper on her behalf at school, but we don't even do papers, so it wasn't a problem. So you may find here too that all sorts of different people are signing official papers representing themselves as mother or father. They're not doing this to try to be sneaky, but an older daughter might be considered the parent, the mother to a younger daughter. So we're trying to teach them at meetings, now that you're here in the US, birth mom, birth dad need to be the official signers of papers. One of the other issues we're having too is as soon as they're coming in, finding a place to stay. And I had mentioned that you come in without a credit score. When you don't have a credit score, you can't get a rental house. You can't get a bank loan. So they're all doubling and tripling and quadrupling up with family members already here at places like Mayor Wright or KPV or up at the Pololo housing, which means that for the first 6 or 8 months, they're probably living in one place and then they're moving to another place. So that means that you may have kids for a couple of weeks that suddenly vanish, or parents, you're not sure where they are. The other problem with this situation is that one of the first things they're told is when they arrive and they get into one of these apartments with 15 other people, tell anybody you live here. So this causes issues when there's a problem at a school or a job. Where do you live? What's your address? What's your phone number? Sometimes they're reluctant to give out that information for fear that the much larger family group will get in trouble because of that. So we are trying to work with the state of what are some good transitional housing issues. And the people who always end up getting hurt the most are the children who are in school. So a lot of times the kids go home and there's 14 relatives they help cook for, or help do the laundry for, or help do homework with. So when your kids go home from school, you think, well, how come they never do their homework? They're doing work from home. It may not be their math work. So invite them to stay after. They want to stay longer at school. They don't automatically want to go home to 16 people, but they're in very overcrowded situations. They're all sharing phone numbers, as I mentioned there too. Schools and community groups get very frustrated. I can never reach anybody. They never respond. Well, because there may be one cell phone being shared by 14 or 15 people. It's another reason that we've kind of encouraged schools, don't let kids take the tablets home without finding out what's their housing situation. They take a computer or a tablet home and they're a house with 15 other people, they may not get to use that tablet or that computer. Someone else might be using it. So these are a lot of the issues they're facing as we try to tackle some of these housing issues that they're facing. One of the biggest recommendations we make, a couple of them are, keep the kids, try to do a Micronesian club after school where the kids can stay and do their schoolwork together, where maybe some of the older kids can help the younger kids because they're happy to stay. That's when they can get their work done before they go home and start undertaking hours of chores. And don't just automatically assume that the parents are ignoring their children. Many of these Micronesian parents are getting second shift and third shift jobs, not 8 to 5 jobs. So if there's a PTA meeting or if there's a community meeting at 7 at night, and you're wondering why aren't any of the Micronesians showing up, they may be working at Walmart or at Ross or at Long's Drugs or at the restaurant on that shift because that's the job that they have to get. So that's one of the issues we're facing. It's not that they don't want to come. They may be working on those strange hours. So I've got some recommendations on this last slide. I see some of the questions being asked, but Angela, if you can go to the next slide there. What are some strategies you can do? And I've seen some people mention this. These newcomer centers are one of the biggest ideas that we've been talking about with the state education system and the state government for about 2 years now. When they come in and they're 5 years old, they're fine. They're going to learn the language. They're going to be shy and quiet at first. The younger they are, though, the quicker they're picking it up. What we're finding, though, is the older the students are, the bigger the gap is. Our high school kids are coming in 5, 6, 7 grade levels behind. The parents who are coming in from outer islands speak, especially the moms, may speak no English at all. Instead of just throwing them into a situation where the teacher is frustrated, the principal is frustrated, and the student, we know the student's going to fail, why not a newcomer center for 6 months or even an entire school year where all we focus on is English and assimilation strategies for the student and the parent. We've actually done a pilot project at Farrington High School. We had about 14 or 15, mostly Chuukese students who were 9th and 10th grade, but were reading at the 3rd grade level. And what had been happening at the high school level across the state as these students were coming in, they were disappearing within a year. And we were finding that a number of the principals were actually admitting to us they were getting students to fill out the 4140 form. Now, I don't want to drop you out of school. That reflects badly on me. I also don't want you taking my yearly test because your scores are going to reflect badly on me. At the rate you're going, you're going to be 24 years old before you graduate, which we can't do anyway. So fill out this form, this 4140, where you're going to homeschool, even though we all know that's not going to happen, and you no longer count as a dropout. And we had a number of principals admit that they were doing this. Sadly, this doesn't help the student. This doesn't help the state of Hawaii, as now you're going to have hundreds and hundreds of 20 and 25-year-olds, down the road who can't get jobs. So what we've suggested, instead of putting the teachers and the principals on the front line of a lot of this assimilation work, let's set up some of these newcomer centers where we can take a year and help them learn, them and their parents, here's what you need to do at school to be successful. So we've piloted it. We're trying to grow this work. I think we're supposed to be at Dole Middle School doing some work. COVID has kind of slowed everything down. But if this is something you feel that would help your school or help your community, please let me know, because we want to set up more of these. Also, we're finding that, especially during COVID, our Micronesian students have fallen even further behind because they're either living in a place that doesn't have good internet, or they're not being allowed to just use the technology on their own. So they're just completely vanishing from the whole system. We're trying to set up someplace near the school that's not at the school, but it's also not at home. Maybe a place where we can set up 40 or 50 tablets or computers. We can have some Chuukese speakers, some Marshallese speakers as tutors. The students can access their schoolwork there while being watched by a tutor. So they don't need to worry about a family member taking the computer away. They're in a safe place. They can get some of the extra help. They can get caught up on their schoolwork. So it's not at home. It's also, since they've not been allowed to go to school, really at school either. So it's kind of a mid-area safe learning hub is what we're calling them. So we've actually submitted some proposals right now to set up a few of these where the school's technology is safe. Farrington High School found out that 60% of the technological devices they were sending home with these students were vanishing. So that just isn't going to work. So maybe a safe place where the stuff can be monitored, but tutorial work is available in language speakers. So these are the two strategies we're looking at right now. And again, I'll answer some questions in a bit on this. I also recommend that at your school or at your community center, you do student and parent surveys and orientation meetings, not PTA meetings. PTA meetings, the good news is PTA meetings don't work anywhere on planet Earth. The same thing happens. The parents of the good kids show up. Those are never the parents we want to talk to. We want to talk to the parents of the students who have some concerns. Very often our Micronesian parents won't show up to those meetings, or if they do, they'll sit in the back and won't really participate. So one of the things I recommend is, once or twice during the year, do a survey with the new students and ask, these surveys have to be confidential. They're not trying to get anyone in trouble, but ask questions like, what island are you from? So you can learn, are they from an island with 300 people or an island with 4,000 people or even 20,000 people? Because it makes a difference. Where you're living, how many people are there? And again, you're not collecting that information to get them in trouble, but if you've got a second or third grade girl, or even a high school age girl, who's in an apartment with 15 other people, I can guarantee you she's being overwhelmed with work when she gets home. Find out too, what other people are in the house, because very often extended family members are there. This can make it very difficult for our students when they go home. Find out too in the survey, are your parents working? What time are they working? Are they working overnight? Are they working when you get home so that dinner or lunch isn't ready for you? You have to provide for yourself. But it's very important that this information be kept as confidential as possible, because you need to build a trust relationship with this community. This is not meant to get young people in trouble, but to help us come up with better strategies for them. So I always advise doing that, and maybe an orientation meeting with new Micronesian parents where you just walk them around the school. They may have never seen a water fountain before, or an automatic door opener, or a remote, to show them, here's the sort of classroom your child will be in. Here's the rules for when you come in. You can't just come at 10 o'clock and pick your child up for an appointment, or because you need to, they need to help you cook at home. If we can, PREL would always love to help translate your handbooks. If you've got handbooks or announcements that need to go out in local languages, especially for the parents, let us know how we can help. Every Micronesian who's moved to Hawaii goes to church somewhere. Find out where they're going to church. In fact, we're finding the best way to do parent meetings is not to do them at the school, but find out where they're attending church and see if you can make announcements there. So very often they're going to church Sunday afternoon. They're using a church building that belongs to another church. So that church will have Sunday morning service. And then around 1 o'clock or so, they'll rent it to the Micronesian community group. And the Micronesians will be there from 1 o'clock to about 4 o'clock or so. And everybody goes. And that's where the mayor of their village back home might be, because he's here in Hawaii for medical reasons. The pastor is a very important title. If you could pass information that way by saying, next week is picture day. Next week is final exam week. Next week, we're having spring break. That's one of the best ways to disseminate information. And you might be able to find someone there who's willing to volunteer at the school to help track down Billy, who you've not seen for 3 weeks. They know where everybody is. They also know each other. They know where everybody lives. They may be seen as less threatening than a principal or a teacher coming to talk to a student. Because again, there's always that concern, oh, if the principal finds out there's 15 of us living together, we might all be kicked out. So find out where they're going to church. See if you can connect with that church or with the church leaders or the community leaders here to help disseminate information. One of the other ideas we have right now is we've been talking to UH about the students who are involved in their education degrees. Could they, as part of a credit class, be involved with our elementary school students or our high school students as tutors, or just to be a part of a classroom to make sure that kids are a little bit more comfortable? A lot of times our students come in, they're uncomfortable for a while, but maybe if they see a college-age student who speaks the language, who looks the same, who knows who they are, that helps that college student, work on teaching strategies and education strategies. It also helps the student. It doesn't cost the school any money because it's part of their credit course. Is there a way that we can get Chaminade, UH, and the local colleges involving their Micronesian students in our school systems to help with some of these assimilation issues? So that's one of the things we're also talking about. Then one of the big strategies is we all love to what we call a Micronesian fair. The Marshallese are great at this. They have a big cultural week that they have every year. They're much more unified than our FSM students because they're all from different states.
But if you were to do something one night or one afternoon where the kids came in and danced for you, sang for you, I promise all the parents would show up for that. They would skip work to come for that. And that would be a chance for you to see these quiet, shy students singing and laughing and dancing, and their parents laughing and dancing and singing. And it would show you a whole new side of them. They would see you also being engaged in this. You might learn a couple words, how to say good morning, how to say how are you, how to learn the very first phrase I learned in Coach Ryan, which was, did you get your homework done yet? You know, some of these little phrases that you might be able to learn will open up a million doors for you. So find out what islands they're from, find out what cultural activities they do, then try to do something with them that's not completely school related, and you'll see them open up quite differently to you. I think that's the last slide, Angela, but just click to the next one. If that's it, we can go to questions. Okay, here's my email, by the way, that you can write to me. There's two other great organizations, Josie Howard, who does We Are Oceania. They've got a website, and Shanty Asher, who was a student of mine years ago in Coach Rye. She's now the Pacific Island Liaison Officer. Angela, what I can do later is send you their emails if you want to share them with everybody. So Shanty's now working for the city. We're all looking for ways to help with some of these assimilation issues. But feel free to write to me with any other questions. And then I thought we could just open it up now, Angela, for any questions anybody might have.
Yes,
thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Paul. This is really wonderful, great information. And that covers one of the questions, actually. But before we go into the Q&A, because we do have them listed out, Paul, for you, I just wanted to let folks know that I will be putting a link for you to take a brief survey in regards to this great presentation. Your thoughts and feedback is very valuable to us. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I will share with you one of the questions, and we have several questions. Hopefully we can get to all of them. But here is the survey link in the chat box right now. So the first question, Paul, that we have posted in the chat box, let's see, wow, there's quite a few. Yeah. Someone put in the chat box, KH, I noticed that my students from Micronesia speak more than one island language. Could you say more about how languages are used in Micronesia? For example, is there a common language throughout the islands, and or island languages multiply intelligible? And I think you kind of mentioned this, you had mentioned it before, that even your own children speak more than one language. But I guess maybe a little bit more detail, or reiterating some of the ways that educators can be a little bit more knowledgeable on this front.
Sure. Now, if they're Marshallese, the vast majority of Marshallese speak the same language. Once you get to the FSM, though, it all changes. Coach Ryan, these are all different from the Marshallese, by the way. Coach Ryans have one language. Pohnpeians, for the most part, have one language, but there's a couple of outer islands who speak a little bit different language. The Chukis have at least 5 languages. So there's a main language in Chuk that most everybody speaks, but then there's some outer island languages which the main islanders don't understand. And the outer islanders will speak. And then when you get to Yap, there's a number of different languages. So we come up with numbers between 14 and 19 different languages between the Marshalls and Palau, depending on who you ask. So what we find, though, is that these kids pick up they're not just dialects, these are different languages. The kids pick up the languages very, very quickly. In fact, you'll find that learning the English isn't going to be the issue. They will learn to hear it right away and speak it fairly good. Reading will be difficult for them, but they're natural linguists. They're very good at it. Sometimes the older parents, it takes a while, but they're different languages. There's very few shared words. I think the word for fish, the word for coconut seems to be the same, but everything else is quite different.
Thank you. Let's see, our next question. Okay, the next question that we have is, let's see, coming from Desiree, does that mean teachers should be more lenient to the children and families? How can we create a fair learning environment when providing grace while they adapt to the American ways?
Which is an excellent question. And one thing I try to bring up to our state leadership when I talk to them is that many of our teachers have been put on the front line of this issue. And I'm not sure that that's fair. Our principals and our teachers are suddenly all their work is graded on these tests. And they love kids. And now they've got a group of young people and families coming in who are way behind where they should be through nobody's fault. And they're getting a good island education, but not getting a good American education. If we just put them into our grade level and they're performing below, how much of my time should I give to 2 students and ignore the other 28 in my classroom, even though I love them all equally? So what I've been trying to say is, I don't know how much lenience you want to give, but maybe be a little bit more understanding of where they're coming from, while we also talk with the state. And I think a lot of this has to come from schools, of these intermediate programs for 6 months or a year, so that when they come into your classroom, both sides aren't set up to fail. We know at the younger ages, the kindergarten, the 1st to 2nd grades, they don't need a whole lot of time. They tend to catch up fairly quickly. The higher the grade level, the further behind they are, the more frustrating it is for everybody. Why put them in that situation when maybe they just need a few months? So we found that with the Farrington project, many of our kids jumped up 2 and 3 WIDA levels on that test in just 3 or 4 months, because they were able to get a lot more individual attention. We didn't know if we could do 1 level, but they'll learn it quickly. But they weren't also worried at the same time about their biology class and their algebra class. So I would just say, don't be lenient, and it may just be the same word. Be more understanding of where they're coming from. And then possibly start from the school level, putting a little bit more pressure, up through the CAS through the central office, to the state of, could we have 6 or 7 of these, newcomer centers set up through the state? And the student comes in, they can take, one of the English tests or something. And if they're 3 or 4 grade levels behind, don't ask us teachers to work miracles. Again, I was a teacher for 30 years, so I know what it's like. We love the kids, but we also know, as much as we want to do a miracle, we can't always do that. And it's just more frustrating for us. So I do think that's the situation we have to set up here somehow.
Okay, thank you. And then the other question that we have here about the Welcome Center from KH, wondering if something like a Welcome Center, like the different states on the continent, might help to discuss the school expectations. So kind of like what you said in terms of, pressuring your leadership, or just sharing the concern that there needs to be more, available, more support available for students. So do you think that's something that might happen, or as something that's being discussed with amongst different welcome centers about these expectations?
And Hawaii is not the only place that has this issue. So, a lot of the information we got was from places like California that have a large number of people coming from Central and South America. What we're finding that is unique to Hawaii is that many of these other countries that have people coming in, they're coming from places that had kind of the same school system, but it was a language barrier. Versus a lot of kids coming in from these very small outer islands, the school system is completely different. It's not a 5-day a week, 8-hour a day, a ton of rules and regulations. It was part of the community life. We did a survey in Chuuk a couple years ago when I was there. On average, students who have a 180-day requirement for a school year, we're going to school 80 to 90 days a year, because all the other activities were seen as school too. So Hawaii is a bit unique when it comes to, we just don't need a welcome center that focuses on language. We need a welcome center for parents and for these students coming in that emphasizes not just language learning, but how you take care of your money. How do you get a job? How do you get housing? How do you let your children do their homework? These sorts of things. And I think that'll make life a lot easier for everybody. And it may only be for 25 or 30% of the population coming in. We find that a lot of our Pohnpeians and Kosraean students who are coming in can transfer fairly quickly, because they've got better school systems. English is spoken a lot more. It's these kids from the far outer islands, from the Marshalls and Chuuk, great kids who are just coming in much further behind that we think we can help with the Welcome Center.
Great. And just to follow up with that, in terms of the Welcome Center, you had mentioned one at Farrington. Are there any developments or any other centers across the Hawaii or Oahu?
I noticed that someone spoke. Wahiawa has done great work for a while up there. I'm very proud of everything I hear up there. They've done a good job. Waipahu's been doing some good work. What a lot of these smaller communities have done is they have reached out to the Chukis communities that are there and have engaged them in the school. They've either tried to find some money where they can hire like a transition officer or someone that can really work with the community. In a couple of these places, there were former political leaders from the islands who have moved here and have a lot of power in that community. Part of it to make these centers work is again, I think these surveys of trying to find out who in your local community is the most respected Micronesian person. Is it the pastor? Is there a mayor here? Is there a former politician that everybody will answer to that you can then engage in the school? What I think both Wahiawa and Waipahu have done is they have found some outside money that has helped. We're trying to convince the department that this is something that they need to put some money behind too, because we want to get away from this whole 4140 thing of just booting kids out. The information we found was that like 60% of the high school age 4140 forms were Micronesian students. It was just the easiest way to solve the problem. And of course, it's not solving anything, just pushing it down the road. So I really think school principals, and I'm not trying to get political at all, I think teachers and principals need to present this as, we love these kids. We want them to be successful. You're asking us to fill in a chasm that is 5 and 6 grade levels wide in the course of a school year, and it's impossible. We would love those at our school to maybe have a classroom or two set aside for a welcoming center so that they can be more successful.
Well, thank you. And I know we have a few other questions, and I do encourage you to reach out to Paul Haddock. We are down to 1 minute, so I want to be able to respect everyone's time, but just express, gratitude. And it's been a great pleasure, Paul, to hear your story and to hear the strategies and tips that you provided us here today to be able to support our students and their families in the Micronesian community. Again, please go to our website, take the survey. I will go ahead and put our website in there, as we will post the recording so folks can take a look at it at a later date. We'll do that sometime next week. And yeah, so again, thank you, Paul, for joining us today, everyone else for joining us for today. And we look forward to hearing from other folks and connecting you with folks more information in our next webinars. Thank you so much, Paul.